When it comes to horror cinema, one of the subgenres that so often splits opinion is the realm of body horror. When thinking of the greats of the subgenre, films such as The Thing, The Blob, Eraserhead, and pretty much a whole bunch of other David Cronenberg movies all come to mind. Away from the famed heavy hitters of body horror though, there are those other great pictures that often end up flying under the radar somewhat. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are Hidden Gem horror movies. Taxidermia. While the majority of films featured on this list are played straight and serious, Taxidermia has a tongue firmly within its cheek. Comedy isn't something you'd necessarily associate with the world of body horror, but that's exactly what this filmmaker serves up with his 2006 movie. Telling the tale of 3 generations of male family members, Taxidermia largely hangs its hat on the notion of behavioral learning, and how what we see is adapted into what we do. First up, we're introduced to, and excuse my pronunciation here, Moro Scavagni, a World War II soldier with unique sexual habits. That is, getting it on with a pig and being able to fire a flame from his dick. Lovely. Moro Scavagni eventually fathers a son, Kalman, who's born with a pig's tail. Rather than a lust for the female form, Kalman has a lust for food and ends up becoming a hefty speed eater. He then eventually has his own son, Lajoska, who replaces the urge to stuff his face with the urge to stuff dead bodies, becoming a taxidermist. All 3 generations here offer up some sort of twisted imagery due to their own particular habits, and the end result is a movie that brilliantly manages to be entertaining and charming, yet totally disgusting at the same time. Street trash. Street trash hammers home 2 points. Firstly, drinking is bad. Secondly, if you are gonna booze it up, be sure to steer clear of the cheap stuff. When a small-time Brooklyn liquor store owner finds a batch of cheap alcohol called Tenafly Viper, he decides the best way to get rid of this booze is to sell it for cheap to the local homeless community. Over 60 years old and way past its best before date, this liquor runs through anyone who drinks it. Like, literally, with the drink's acid-like properties causing it to melt those who sup on the grog. Full of some nicely mushy demises, street trash never takes itself entirely too seriously. After all, it's a film based around booze that melts bones and flesh, and maybe does feel a little off its time, but it's for sure a fun picture that has certain elements of social commentary and satire at play. Possession. 1981's Possession is an absolutely bonkers film. To break things down to the most basic of fashions, the film revolves around Anna and Mark, a disgruntled married couple. Mark is a spy who spends long spells away from home, while Anna has started to descend into madness after suffering a miscarriage. As Possession gets into its second act, Anna is revealed to have been having several affairs, but most disturbingly, she has a second home where she keeps a bizarre tentacled creature who she will happily kill for. To make this even more bizarre, said creature ends up being revealed as a twisted doppelganger of Anna's husband Mark. In amongst the sheer insanity of the picture, Isabella Gianni puts in one of the all-time great nuts performances. So great is Gianni at playing crazy here, she'd go on to spend a large chunk of her career typecast in similar such crazed, erratic and intense roles. As for Mark Sam Neill, he just about veers on the right side of jumping the shark with his performance as Mark, with him pulling back at just the right times when he seems about to get a little too over the top with the craziness. The Eyes of My Mother. Like many a sturdy body horror picture, Nicholas Pasha's The Eyes of My Mother is a major head that will stay with you long after you've finished watching this 2016 effort. The Eyes of My Mother is both a disturbing, chilling movie and somewhat of a poignant, emotional film about loneliness. As a child, protagonist Francesca is trained by her surgeon mother how to remove eyeballs from animals. When a passing salesman arrives at their farmhouse door and bludgeons her ma to death, Francesca and her father keep this murderer hostage in their barn for years, with young Chiska taking out his eyeballs and vocal cords and proclaiming him to be her only friend. Skipping ahead to the present day, salesman Charlie is still tied up in the barn, although Francesca's father is now dead. Once our lead character is forced to kill Charlie after he tries to escape, the reality is that Francesca is now all alone. Thus, she is soon on the hunt for a new friend to keep eyeless and chain up in the family barn. Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer. Most casual moviegoers won't have heard of Tetsuo the Iron Man, and even less people will be aware of Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer. That first Tetsuo picture centers on a businessman who accidentally runs over a metal fetishist. As payback for this, said metal enthusiast gradually transforms his attacker into a twisted part man, part machine hybrid. In Tetsuo 2, our central creation is back in a sequel that, despite ignoring certain parts of the first film, sees him evolving to the point of becoming a living cyberkinetic gun. With his son kidnapped, our Iron Man embarks on a bloody rampage of revenge that only amps up further once he inadvertently kills his offspring when trying to take out one of his kidnappers. Amongst all of this, there's plenty more at play thanks to a villain aptly and simply named Mad Scientist, doing his best to inject the kidnapped gang's members with a serum that will turn them into beings similar to our main protagonist, Taniguchi Tomu. Like Tetsuo the Iron Man, Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer is one of those films that any and all horror hounds should watch at least once. American Mary. From Jen and Sylvia Soska and starring genre fave Katharine Isabelle, American Mary centers on the titular Mary Mason. A medical student with spiraling bills to pay, aspiring surgeon Mary ends up turning her hand to body modification work in order to help ease her financial woes. How does one end up in such a seedy profession? Why, all this started after Isabelle's character applied for a job at a local strip club. With the club's basement housing a bloodied, dying man, Mary's skill set sees her talent utilized to patch the fella up in exchange for a cool $5 grand. While she feels extreme guilt and paranoia after having become involved in this shady underworld, Mary's finances, or lack thereof, outweigh the moral dilemmas that come with such work. Before you know it, our headline act is turning people into human dolls or making the infamous demon twins of Berlin very much live up to their name. There's a lot more going on in American Mary than just twisted bodies, mind, for there's themes of sexual abuse, abuse of power, and absolutely some gory revenge as the picture plays out. Excision. Adapted from the 2008 short of the same name, Richard Bates Jr.'s Excision pulls plenty from the legendary David Cronenberg when it comes to its more stomach-churning moments. Here, Anna Lynn McCord plays a high school student obsessed with the notion of a career in medicine. There's nothing wrong with having such dreams, of course, but the problem with McCord's Pauline is that she's clearly a little deranged in how she's going about obtaining said dream. As soon as McCord's character starts to have orgasmic dreams of her and others being mutilated and massacred in bloody fashion, that's enough to send the alarm bells ringing for audiences. So enamored by blood is Pauline, she even chooses to lose her virginity while on her period, all unbeknownst to Adam, the young lad involved in this act. Still, Adam himself has his issues, for he cheats on his girlfriend by having sex with Pauline in the first place. Where things really take a dark turn is when Pauline learns her cystic fibrosis suffering sister needs a lung transplant. Doing what any totally not sane person would do in this situation, Pauline kidnaps a young neighbor and sets about realizing her medical ambitions by partaking in a hodgepodge surgical procedure to remove the poor neighbor's lungs. In My Skin. From writer, director, and star Marina Devan, In My Skin is a picture that may leave some feeling a tad queasy upon a first watch. Pulling a little from David Cronenberg's Crash, but turning things up to 11, In My Skin centers on Devan's Esther and the joy she gets from self-mutilation. The film starts with Esther deciding to leave a party to take a dimly lit walk across a construction site. After a fall leaves her outfit torn, it's soon revealed how this tumble has also majorly sliced up Esther's leg. Still, rather than seek medical attention, our headline act decides to carry on partying with her friends, with her even getting a buzz from the injury she sustained. From here, Esther starts to harm herself for the pleasure it brings her, but then takes things to an entirely other level of disturbing when she actually starts to eat parts of her own body. So self-mutilation becomes what can only be described as self-cannibalism. With twisted visuals, In My Skin never shies away from Esther's increasingly gruesome acts, and as such is a picture only for those with a strong stomach. Thanatomorphose. For those wondering what the hell Thanatomorphos means, a quick online search defines the word as referring to a quote, set of morphological alterations determined by death. Starring Caden Rose as Laura, this is a film that's not for the weak of stomach. For disgruntled nurse Laura, she uses sex as a way to at least feel something in her life, with abusive dickhead Antoine her go-to partner for this. As Thanatomorphos plays out though, the more Laura has sex, the more her physical form starts to wilt. For those looking for something meaningful, this one can be viewed as a commentary on Laura's emotional state. For those looking for something gooey and garish, it absolutely ticks those boxes and then some. Throughout Thanatomorphos, horror hounds get to watch Laura's body wilt and decay in a brilliantly detailed yet utterly gnarly way. Seriously, there's body parts falling apart, maggots are running rampant, and the whole process of Laura's transformation is showcased in all of its graphic glory.
Martin. One of horror's all-time greats, George A. Romero is the person who popularized the concept of zombies, or ghouls as he referred to them, with offerings such as Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and of course, Day of the Dead. And hell, I even like Land of the Dead as well, sue me. Away from these ghouls, the legendary filmmaker also impressed with Season of the Witch, The Crazies, and the stunning Creepshow. And then, well, then there's Martin. Focusing on another staple of horror, Martin is a vampire movie with a twist. What makes Martin so great is that the audience is never really sure whether or not the titular character is actually a vampire or not. Martin claims to be a vampire who is far older than he looks, and we see him experience memories of gothic lynch mobs and classic vampire seductions. But is this real though? In terms of how he gets his fix, the character sedates his victims, slices their skin, and then drinks their blood. And while Martin forever claims he's a legitimate vampire, those around him doubt these proclamations. The fact that Romero himself viewed this as his favorite film means that Martin should absolutely be on every horror fan's hit list to get to at some point. The Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is a vampire-less vampire movie about characters obsessed with vampires. In short, it's perfect for this list. Here, our leads are a couple of troubled teenagers, Milo and Sophie, who find each other in a world where they are so often shunted or bullied. In Milo's case, he is insisting that he's a vampire, to the point that he even drinks human blood. Milo is the one who's always eager to consume more and more knowledge about vampirism, with him adamant that Nosferatu is a truly accurate depiction of what being a vampire is like. For Sophie though, she's more of the thought process that Twilight is a genuine portrayal of vampires. Yes, seriously, I'm not making this plot up. A little like Let the Right One In some regard, The Transfiguration is a slow, delicate tale anchored by two youngsters, and two characters who find one another just at the right time. Well, initially anyway, for things eventually do become mighty strained between the pair when Sophie discovers the details on her friend's, hunting habits. Blood Vessel. While a whole host of Shudder's original content has been hugely praised, this effort seemed to get a little lost in the shuffle upon release. Not only is Blood Vessel a unique beast when it comes to the plot, it's also a great vampire movie that deserves to get way more love from the masses. In fact, this is a picture that even a good portion of horror hounds haven't managed to pick up on as of yet. In terms of the uniqueness of the film that I just referenced, Blood Vessel is set during the days of World War II, with our main protagonists being a ragtag group of survivors stranded at sea. When their lifeboat comes upon an abandoned German ship, what could possibly go wrong? Of course, it doesn't take long for the realization to kick in that this vessel is lifeless for a reason, and that reason is that a gang of vampires are running rampant on it. Marking this picture out from many of its peers, it also features vampires who come across as somewhat sympathetic. Sure, they're still vampires doing murderous vampire things, but that's not necessarily by choice. Likewise, the actual design of these bloodsuckers is way more impressive than what we've seen in the vast majority of recent vamp pictures. Shadow of the Vampire. Shadow of the Vampire has quite a brilliant premise at its core. That being, what if famed method actor Max Schreck of Nosferatu fame really was a vampire? To make things even better, Willem Dafoe is playing Schreck here, while John Malkovich plays Nosferatu director F.W. Murnau as the two look to create their movie masterpiece. For Shadow of the Vampire, the director and his cast and crew clearly had a whole bunch of fun playing with the very real stories of just how intensely method Schreck was with his roles, and also in how Murnau would allow his star to push boundaries. In this case, those boundaries mean that Dafoe's Max actually gets to chomp on his co-star's neck and drain their blood. Released in 2000, Shadow of the Vampire is just a blast. Delivered as a fictional documentary on the making of Nosferatu, there's some darkly comedic moments in amongst some genuinely great gore, and both Dafoe and Malkovich are absolutely on fire in their respective roles. Given the name value of its two leads, it's nuts how little this movie is talked about when discussing the better vampire movies out there. Near Dark. One of the most beloved, famous vampire movies of all time is 1987's The Lost Boys. But while Joel Schumacher was wowing audiences with that picture, the same year saw Near Dark somewhat fly under the radar. From future Oscar winner Kathryn Bigelow, Near Dark follows a family of vampires who drive around in a blacked out RV in the day and then feast on locals by night. To be fair, that's a pretty smart plan, and to make all of this more entertaining, there's a belting cast of familiar 80s faces, with Bill Paxton, Jeanette Goldstein, Jenny Wright and Lance Henriksen amongst the key cast here. The plans of these bloodsuckers are thrown for a loop though when Wright's mayor ends up falling for one of the group's intended meals. That meal is Caleb Colton, and after becoming infected he ends up joining our vampires on their crusade as tensions rise over Caleb's unwillingness to kill. As Near Dark plays out, Caleb and May have their eye on life away from the rest of the Horde, but May's longtime travel companions aren't so keen to let her slip out of their grip. The Lair of the White Worm. Floppy-head Hugh Grant and future Doctor Who, and likewise I guess floppy-head Peter Capaldi in a vampire movie? Yeah, that did really happen. Back before either man hit the big time, Grant and Capaldi got to vamp it up in 1988's The Lair of the White Worm. Loosely adapted from Bram Stoker's novel of the same name, this Ken Russell picture centers around the legend of the Ditambum worm. When Capaldi's archaeology student finds what he believes to be a giant snake skull, he starts to dive deep on connecting said skull to the aforementioned snake-like legend of centuries past. For Hugh Grant, he plays James D'Ampton, an ancestor of the man who purportedly banished the D'Ampton worm back in the day. There's missing persons, sultry seductresses, mystical and magical shenanigans, a huge amount of phallic imagery, and some vibrant, trippy visuals when things really hit the fan. So, I know what you're thinking, where does vampire movie come into all of this? Well, while serpents are very much the focus of The Lair of the White Worm, the film also works brilliantly as a vampiric ball of energy once it gets going. With Lady Sylvia, a fanged, smouldering figure on a mission to sink her teeth into human flesh, a bite from Sylvia also results in her victims carrying on the curse and condition that she herself has. Plus, you know, it's also based on a tale from the legendary Bram Stoker, which definitely helps. The werewolf versus the vampire woman. Werewolves and vampires have long been a staple of the horror genre, and this 1971 picture served up a nice dollop of both. The werewolf versus the vampire woman, though, is actually the 5th film in a franchise, but more importantly here, the werewolf versus the vampire woman, and the initial reception to it, is also viewed as being the launching point for the Spanish horror boom of the 1970s. Picking up after the events of The Fury of the Wolfman, Werewolf Daninsky is brought back to life once 2 silver bullets are removed from his heart as part of an autopsy. Vampires come into this because 2 students, the brilliantly named Elvira and Genevieve, unwittingly resurrect Countess Wandessa Danacity after accidentally spilling their blood on Wandessa's corpse. Before you know it, Elvira and Genevieve have been corrupted by the Countess's power, and all 3 end up on a collision course with the Wolfman. Black Sunday. For a spell, Barbara Steele was not only one of the go-to horror names, but she was someone so often associated with playing sultry seductresses with a dark underbelly. In that regard, that meant she was utterly perfect for vampire movies. With the Steele-headlined Black Sunday, Mario Bava crafted a stunning piece of gothic horror that holds up remarkably well to this day. There are small villages, spooky castles, torch-wielding townsfolk, and of course a vampire witch at the center of this terror. That vampire witch is Asia Varda, who was killed and entombed back in 1630. Jumping ahead 200 years from her demise, we find her descendant Katia targeted by a partially resurrected Asia who is desperate to be reincarnated in Katia's body. Barbara Steele marvelously plays both roles, bringing totally different performances to the different characters. And with such a rich classic setting, Black Sunday serves as an ideal time capsule of how great the horror of the time could be. Kiss of the Damned. What's most striking about Kiss of the Damned is just how darn beautiful the film looks. At a time when Twilight and True Blood were all the rage, Cassavetes' movie delivered something more in tune with the classic gothic vampire efforts of decades gone by, pulling clear inspiration from European icons like Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento for colours and textures. Plot-wise, Kiss of the Damned revolves around vampire Jejuna and her non-vampire would-be lover Paolo. To her credit, Jejuna does her best not to get too close to Paolo, spurning his advances for fear of losing control. For Paolo, he spends the initial portion of the movie trying to convince her that he's absolutely ready for what is going to be more than just a gnarly love bite. With these lovebirds wanting to simply spend eternity together and harvest blood from animals rather than vampires, the landscape of Kiss of the Damned is thrown up in the air when Dajuna's overly sexed, morally different sister Mimi decides to pay this couple a visit. The Addiction. While Abel Ferrara is best known for helming the likes of Bad Lieutenant, King of New York, and infamous video nasty The Driller Killer, in which he also starred, the filmmaker's true masterpiece is his relatively under-the-radar 1995 picture, The Addiction. Starring The Conjuring's Lili Taylor, this twisted black and white offering is something that brings far more to the table than most other vampiric efforts. Taylor plays Kathleen here, a philosophy student who was attacked and bizarrely bitten during the movie's opening act. From there, Kathleen becomes extremely ill and eventually develops a thirst for blood. With this thirst, the addiction of the film's title, Taylor's character descends into a desperate spiral of instinct and obsession. That is, of course, until she meets a super cool Christopher Walken. The Addiction is an all-time great vampire film, yet it's one that was criminally overlooked by general audiences when they debate the best blood-sucking efforts out there. Oozing with style, brimming with social commentary, with a career best performance from Lili Taylor as she carries so much of the film, and Christopher Walken being, well, he's Christopher Walken, isn't he? This rollercoaster ride ticks so many of the right boxes to mark it out as something genuinely special.
It Stains the Sands Red. It Stains the Sands Red is exactly the type of movie that rewards you for venturing into independent horror. It's directed by Colin Minihan, who's now making waves after quietly building his resume with titles such as Spiral, Grave Encounters, and Z. This is a zombie movie like no other. Brittany Allen plays Molly, a woman who's trying to leave her tarnished past behind in a zombie-infested Las Vegas. With a remote airfield potentially providing a means of escape, she sets off on a life-changing journey through the desert on foot whilst being relentlessly pursued by a lone zombie. Thanks to its unique premise and small cast, the film makes for a much-needed and refreshing change of pace for the zombie subgenre. Rather than a group of survivors fending for themselves against an unforgiving horde of meat-hungry monsters, it offers a slow-burn escapade that's tonally diverse. Though it may not excel in any one area, it's a well-rounded indie that warrants your attention. Dead Shack. This 2017 independent horror comedy is so little known that it doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which is a shame because it's a short 85-minute blast of indie zombie fun that deserves a few more eyes. It follows a trio of teenagers who are holidaying at a remote cabin in the woods. As boredom quickly consumes the teens, they go for a wander into the local area only to stumble across a dodgy-looking shack. Looking through the windows, they watch as a couple of guys are consumed by zombies contained in that shack. And as things do, one thing leads to another and a fight for survival in the middle of nowhere ensues. Though it doesn't bring anything new to the table, Dead Shack jam-packs a ton of charm, plenty of guts, and more than the occasional moment of levity to proceedings. A lot of the humour is juvenile and sometimes doesn't mesh with the rest of the movie, but don't let that deter you from a chuckle-worthy zombie gem. Juan of the Dead. It's time to go international with this entry, as you're about to learn about one of the finest Spanish-Cuban zombie movies to ever be made. And on that note, it's probably one of the very few Spanish-Cuban zombie movies ever to be made. Now, don't let the terribly derivative title fool you. It's much better than it sounds. If anything, Juan of the Dead does Romero proud. Not because its name is a shady imitation, but because the movie imbues political subtext into the narrative. The titular hero, Juan, is a bread-and-butter slacker with little to do other than try and fail to reconnect with his daughter. However, when a zombie uprising presents itself and the country's government dismisses it as a dissident uprising, a new kind of Cuban revolution begins. Now, don't get me wrong, it's no deep political commentary, but with splatter and humour abound in this very slapstick zomcom feature, it's brought to life by the political undertones it wears so proudly on its sleeve. With an 83% approval score on Rotten Tomatoes, you can certainly do a lot worse than this international horror foray. Wormwood, Road of the Dead. Trust the Aussies to deliver an action horror with plenty of bites. And what's better is that it's essentially Mad Max with zombies. If that tease of a description doesn't whet your appetites, then nothing will. Kaya Roach Turner made his feature film directorial debut with this action-packed slice of undead mayhem. The movie follows a mechanic called Barry who, after losing his wife and daughter at the beginning of a zombie apocalypse, goes on the hunt for his missing sister. Trouble is, she's being held captive by merciless soldiers, and there's also a mad scientist on the loose. Something that helps this film stand out from the packs of shuffling undead movies that all look alike is how insane it gets. The presence of a mad scientist is barely the tip of the iceberg, because there's also telepathy and zombie blood being used for gasoline. It's a wildly entertaining road trip that you just can't miss. Blood Quantum. Once upon a time, there was a breed of zombie movies that depicted average people struggling to deal not only with the consequences of an unexpected undead outbreak, but also fellow survivors against the backdrop of societal subtext. They were primarily directed by the legendary George A. Romero, and many that followed barely even scratched the surface of the potential he unlocked. Well, in 2019, director Jeff Barnaby dared to dream, and the result was Blood Quantum. Though it's a bit rough around the edges like many indie movies, Blood Quantum delivers on everything one would expect from a zombie flick, whilst also bluntly demonstrating the devastating impact of colonialism on the existence of Native Americans. It's one of the few zombie movies to have arrived in recent years that would most likely have received a seal of approval from Godfather George A. Romero himself. It's brutal, bloody, and a brilliant watch. Della Morte Dell'Amore. Della Morte Dell'Amore, otherwise known as Cemetery Man, is what happens when you take the Italian director Michele Soavi and give him the one and only Rupert Everett as the leading man, and then put him in a graveyard. It is, in other words, a wonderfully bizarre slice of Italian cinema. Partly inspired by the Dylan Dog comics and sort of based on its namesake novel, Della Morte Dell'Amore is the kind of movie you could only get from our eccentric brethren in Europe. It follows Francesco, a cemetery caretaker who passes his time with old telephone directories whilst contemplating his place in life, all while ensuring that the constantly rising undead are put back in their place. However, things get topsy-turvy when he falls for an enchanting widow and they do the horizontal shuffle on someone's grave, only for her to get bitten, die, and rise from the dead. The narrative meanders, and at times events feel nonsensical, but Everett's nonchalant performance combined with the movie's nutty events make this a zombie movie like nothing you've ever seen. Dead Snow 2: Red vs. Dead. In 2009, the arrival of a little Norwegian movie called Dead Snow landed with an explosively bloody splat and arguably launched Nazi zombies back into the mainstream. 5 years later, it spawned a sequel that nobody asked for, but everybody should watch. The first film's director returned and picked up where the old film left off, now choosing to amplify the gore to absurd new heights. After sole survivor Martin discovers he is still in possession of a single gold coin from the Nazis' haul, he is once again relentlessly pursued by Herzog and his ravenous horde. Whereas the previous movie took place within the confines of a remote cabin and its even remoter surrounding area, its sequel branches out into neighbouring towns which include a World War II museum. Thanks to some grotesque humour, witty banter, and gallons of blood and guts, not to mention an epic fight between zombie armies that involves a tank, Dead Snow 2: Red vs. Dead is a perfect, entertaining sequel for all the horror fans out there. The Revenant. No, this is not the movie that snagged Leo his first Oscar win. This is the zombie flick that came out 6 years earlier with exactly the same name. Which is better? Well, that's up to you. Directed by D. Kerry Pryor, who worked on VFX for Bubba Ho-Tep and the Phantasm franchise, this independent darling won a number of awards at many horror film festivals across the globe during its release. The movie focuses on a formerly deceased soldier who unexpectedly returns from the grave and who must deal with his new way of undead life with the help of his best buddy. Whilst getting to grips with his new state, the duo fall into the role of zombie vigilantes who fight crime on the night streets of Los Angeles. It's daft, but it's a cheeky addition to the undead genre, even with its eye-opening 2-hour-long runtime. Cockneys vs. Zombies. You should always approach any movie with verses in the title with a truckload of skepticism and a very open mind. The quality of such movies can range from the really good to the astonishingly bad. Thankfully, Cockneys vs. Zombies is in the upper echelons of this niche subgenre. Although that doesn't necessarily say a lot, the movie does exactly what it says on the tin with a grisly smile and a lot of bad taste laughs. After a group of bank robbers find themselves in the midst of a zombie outbreak in East End London, they must rush to the aid of their grandparents who are stuck fending for themselves in a retirement home and escape the capital. From a legendary roll call of homegrown actors going to war with zombies to Alan Ford swearing for Britain to the appalling but humorous kicking of a zombie baby, everything you could ever want from a brash British zombie feature, Cockneys vs. Zombies has it. Dead and Breakfast. Spoofs are notoriously hard to pull off effectively. For every scary movie, you have a Scary Movie 4 and 5. It's even harder when you purposefully attempt to make a so bad it's a good movie, but Dead and Breakfast just about does it by reveling in the schlocky, low-budget nature of its own making. You'll need to look past the cookie-cutter premise of people stuck in an old farmhouse fending for their lives, and the dreadful so bad it's bad DVD artwork, but when you do, you'll find an entertaining splatter-filled jaunt of a zombie movie that even has a dance number. Despite its non-existent budget aesthetic, this 2004 feature has surprising appearances by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, David Carradine, and Jeremy Sisto amongst its cast.
The Pact. With an extremely select release in 2012, The Pact is one of supernatural horror's best-kept modern-day secrets. Very much a family affair on the spooky front, the focus of the pack is on the Barlow family. When their mother dies, strange sisters Annie and Nicole are left to prepare the funeral. And after Nicole and a cousin go missing, Annie becomes embroiled in a supernatural mystery tied to their family home. Or while Casper Van Dien's cop suspects Katie Lotz's Annie of having her own nefarious intentions. As much as The Pact is a supernatural movie, it ends up becoming just as much a whodunit picture once it gets into its final act. There are certain truths to be uncovered as the film goes on, and those truth reveals are accompanied by some great scares and moments of suspense. Exeter. Also known as the Asylum, Marcus Nispel's Exeter is a supernatural terror that takes place in the ever-wise location of an abandoned mental hospital. A group of your standard pretty young things head to this locale to party, and they soon realise that there's something a little paranormal about this asylum, because of course there is. But rather than take this as a sign that they should get their flub out of there, our central protagonists instead opt to have a little bit of fun. When one of them, Rory, appears to levitate, our main characters yuck it up and believe there's just to be one added layer of partying for their plans. Well, that is until Rory starts violently lashing out and speaking in tongues. Locked in this asylum, these friends then start to be possessed one by one after a DIY exorcism totally backfires, with solid scares and some nice twists. Exeter stands out from the pack in how its spirits get straight to it and don't pull any punches. Likewise, the film deserves extra props for taking a generic bunch of characters and managing to make them relatively likeable, which, let's face it, that's something that so many horror films totally fail at. Below. For some of us, the very notion of being cramped in a submarine deep in the ocean is nightmare fuel. Throw in supernatural shenanigans, and that takes the terror and tension to an even greater level. Set during World War II, the submarine in question in Below is the US vessel known as Tiger Shark. Having picked up 3 survivors from a sunken British medical ship, the claustrophobia of being stuck in a tin can is amplified when mysterious voices start to ring out around the Tiger Shark, all as members of the crew disappear. Adding an extra sense of appeal to Below, there's a ragtag cast of great character actors here, including Breece Greenwood, Olivia Williams, Jason Fleming, Dexter Fletcher, and a pre-hangover Zach Galifianakis, leading the charge here. Unfortunately for those involved with Below though, the film sunk without a trace upon its initial release, as reflected by a box office return of barely $600,000 from a budget of $40 million. The Last Winter, where Below utilised the claustrophobic setting of a submarine to amp up its terrors, The Last Winter opted to use the vast emptiness of the Arctic for its terror. This 2007 picture revolves around a group of Arctic oil workers who find themselves in the crosshairs of a myth spirit that's determined to stop the oil of the land from being exploited by these fat cats. And rightly so. Not just is The Last Winter a supernatural horror movie, but clearly there are some strong messages here about the environment and about the damage that we're all doing to it. Yes, you, and yes, unfortunately me. Let's do better, people. Ron Perlman heads up the cast here as the oil industry championing, climate change doubting Ed Pollock, with Ed overseeing an operation that's delving into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the hunt for a new energy source. For Pollock and his crew, their work finds them tormented and haunted by something otherworldly that's looking to either drive them to sanity or just kill them dead. The biggest thing The Last Winter has going for it, apart from Ron Perlman of course, is that it's a film that constantly keeps you on your toes with some genuine surprises and shocks as this story plays out. The Beyond. When many think of Lucio Fulci's work in horror, movies that immediately spring to mind are the likes of White Fang, Zombie 2, City of the Living Dead, and The House by the Cemetery. One film often overlooked though is 1981's The Beyond. In actuality, The Beyond is the second leg of Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy that began with City of the Living Dead and concluded with The House by the Cemetery. Still, most casual horror fans tend to not even know The Beyond exists, let alone that it's part of this trilogy. For the film, it follows Catriona McCall's Lisa Merrill, as she inherits a Louisiana hotel that was once the location of a grisly murder. Not just that, but the belief is the hotel may even be a portal directly to hell. Despite plentiful townsfolk pleading with Lisa to not reopen the hotel, McCall's character, of course, dumbly does the complete opposite. For her, she views the Seven Doors Hotel as a way to make some big bucks. As you can see where this is going, those plans are hit hard when ghosts, spiders, zombies, and a good old dose of black magic all come into play in this chilling, stylish spookfest. For those with a penchant for Fulci at his most, well, Fulci, The Beyond is an absolute must-see. Dead End, Christmas Eve, the dead of night, a quiet countryside back lane, What could possibly go wrong? This is a setup for Dead End, with the Harringtons deciding to take a shortcut as they head off to visit family for the festive season. After patriarch Frank has a near miss after he falls asleep at the wheel, the film starts to venture into supernatural territory, not least in how our protagonists are stalked by a dead baby-carrying woman dressed in white, and they're visited by a hearse. Putting it bluntly, things then get proper weird as the Harringtons drive round in circles and all have extremely odd encounters with something. Dead End does go a little bit cheesy with its twists and turns at times, but that works in its favour and adds a little to the charm. And in genre phase Ray Wise and Lin Shaye, this 2003 picture has two ideal leads to balance those scares with Dead End's more humorous and outright odd moments. House 4: The Repossession. A pseudo-sequel to the original film, House 4 goes back to the roots of what this franchise was based around. As in, lots of spooky scares that could be enjoyed by adults and children alike. Following the expletive-laced, gore-tastic third House effort, this approach was certainly a welcome return for the House series. The Repossession sees William Katt's Roger Cobb brought back from the first film, complete somehow with a new wife and a daughter in tow. But after Roger is killed in a car accident early on, it's his wife Kelly who takes centre stage as she takes residence in the creepy family home, all while having to fend off her brother-in-law and his plans to take possession of the house for himself. In House 4: The Repossession, there's bloody showers, there's talking pizzas, there's classic mirror messages, and there's a whole host of other familiar tropes all included here. House 4 is very much worth hunting down, particularly if you have a thing for talking pizzas. The Changeling. The big question when putting this video together was whether or not The Changeling is really a hidden gem, a slow burn psychological supernatural offering. This 80s film centers on George C. Scott's John Russell, a composer who moves out to a spooky Victorian mansion following the tragic death of his wife and daughter. With this mansion having been vacant for 12 years, it's no surprise when strange goings-on start to happen. Bizarre banging sounds, there's windows smashing, taps turning on, ghostly visions, and all of this eventually leading John to a locked, hidden room up in the property's attic. From there, an investigation into the sordid past of the house and its previous owners delivers quite the impactful, fiery finale for this absolute hidden gem of a movie. Absentia. In this offering, Courtney Bell's pregnant Trisha is left stunned when her missing husband Daniel returns after a mysterious 7-year absence. For those wondering about the title of the film, this relates to Trisha finally getting to a point in her life where she's accepted her husband is likely dead. As such, she's preparing to publicly declare that, which is an act known as pronouncing somebody as being dead in absentia. When her ex-addict sister Callie comes to say, Trisha has her sibling assist her in formalizing Daniel's death and in helping her to move house. But as the moving date edges ever closer, troubled Trisha starts to have feverish nightmares and visions of her husband that are put down to guilt. It's only when Trisha decides to go on a date with a local cop that a barefoot, bloody, painfully thin Daniel resurfaces. With a spooky tunnel, plenty of questions, and even an eerie creature at its core, Absentia is totally worth tracking down. The Innkeepers. From writer-director Ty West, 2011's The Innkeepers is one of the great modern-day horror hidden gems, period. Starring horror favourite Sarah Paxton, this spooky picture is set in an old inn that's due to close imminently, with Paxton's Claire and Pat Healy's Luke as two employees tasked with overseeing the Yankee Peddler Inn's final weekend of operation. This pair of would-be ghost hunters find the hotel's haunted history resurfacing to make sure the venue goes out with a bang. At the centre of these supernatural shenanigans, there's the mystery of Madeline O'Malley, a jilted bride who purportedly hanged herself at the hotel in the 1800s. Throw in an actress turned medium and a suicidal old fella, and The Innkeepers has all of its main pieces in place. Like certain other Ty West movies, The Innkeepers is also a film that's brimming with style and texture, with it also offering up some genuinely great scares as the picture progresses. Blackwater. Loosely based on a real tragedy, David Nerlich and Andrew Trauke's 2007 Blackwater finds lovebirds Grace and Adam and Grace's sister Lee on a fishing trip in a mangrove swamp. When their tour guide wisely suggests they go a little further afield, that's where things take a literal turn for the worse as a saltwater crocodile capsizes their boat. After that tour guide is devoured, our core three are caught between a rock and a hard place. Either take short-term solace up a tree, or swim out to their upturned boat and make a break for safety. To compound this predicament, nobody else is aware that they've even taken this trip. daylight is slipping away, and this crocodile is very much in its natural habitat, and it's very much hungry. Blackwater plays with your expectations, masterfully uses the one sole location where so much of the feature takes place, takes an extremely serious approach to its subject, and it could well be the greatest crocodile feature you've ever seen, or not seen in this case. Sweetheart. On the surface, 2019 Sweetheart is very much a standard creature feature, but there's so much more going on here. Headlined by a brilliant Kiersey Clemons, the film is brimming with themes of privilege and toxic relationships. As for the basic monster of the piece, that's a good old-fashioned sea beast. For Clemons' Jen, she's washed up on a remote island after a storm causes her boat to sink. Slowly but surely, Jen's friends, some dead, some alive, begin to likewise wash up on this island as she tries her best to convince them that there really is a monster on the loose. Clemons is phenomenal here, and the tension building and utilization of Sweetheart's monster, nicely taking a less is more approach at times, is exemplary. Sweetheart is a smart, sharp movie that interestingly approaches your standard creature feature with one eye firmly fixed on social commentary. Nightbreed. When thinking of movies adapted from the works of the legendary Clive Barker, Hellraiser or Candyman immediately come to mind. Sadly, few will make mention of Nightbreed. Adapted from his 1988 Cabal story, Nightbreed was actually written and directed by Barker, and despite bombing upon its release, the movie has since gone on to become somewhat of a cult favourite, partly thanks to Clive Barker being able to put his own director's cut together. While the bulk of the movies on this list feature one single monster, Nightbreed has a whole plethora of them along for the ride, and the majority of these monsters are actually the good guys. Aaron Boone is convinced that he's a serial killer by his doctor, Decker. In reality, this doctor, played by the iconic David Cronenberg no less, is the killer and is merely framing his patient. Having had visions of a strange underground world known as Midian, Boone eventually ends up in that realm, which is filled by creatures known as the Nightbreed. Keen to kill Boone in order to cover up his dirty little secret, Boone finds himself rallying the Nightbreed in helping him stay alive, and also to help this repressed, once-hunted race in their quest for peace. Plus, you know, there's a magical Danny Elfman score draped all over this. Mad God. Could a stop-motion animation film which spent 30 years in development really be a truly terrifying experience? If it's filth, if it's Mad God, yes, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Finally released in 2022, Mad God is a film that covers so much in a way that's bafflingly, bizarrely brilliant. In its loosest form, Mad God takes place in a post-apocalyptic landscape where we follow an unnamed figure, known only as the Assassin, who's dropped into a land filled with all kinds of sinister creatures and eerie developments. As we witness all manner of twisted creature designs and oddball sequences, such as an autopsy turning into a birthing scene, the action is accompanied by a chilling, nerve-shredding soundtrack, and the film has just such a unique way of framing what you're seeing. It's rare that you see stop-motion features these days at all, and it's even rarer to see a horror movie crafted in such a way, but this really works in such a highly impactful, atmospheric, and ultimately uncomfortable way. To say Mad God is a full-on assault on the senses would be an understatement. And Tippett and his Tippett studio crew deserve all the praise in the world for what is an absolute masterpiece of terror, Shin Godzilla. For those in Japan, Shin Godzilla is absolutely not a hidden gem. For those outside of the country though, this is a film that largely flew under the radar, as highlighted by $76 million of Shin Godzilla's global box office haul of $78 million coming solely from Japan. To put into context how strong Shin Godzilla did in Japan, that territory's box office number is more than the worldwide figures for 1998's Godzilla, 2014's Godzilla, 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, and 2021's Godzilla vs. Kong. All movies which had at least 10 times the budget of Shin Godzilla. Still, those who did catch the feature during its theatrical release or on its subsequent home release tend to have nothing but praise for Toho's soft reboot of the wider Godzilla franchise. Part of the charm of Shin Godzilla is in how it very much takes things back to basics, delivering a somewhat minimalist film, well, as minimalist a movie as you can do about a giant city-destroying monster, focusing on political power plays and the ground level people forced to deal with the fallout of Godzilla's destruction across Tokyo and beyond. Genuinely, this is one of the very best Godzilla films of all time. Cub. Also known as Whelp in some territories, Jonas Gavarit's Cub is a creature feature with a nice slither of mystery at play. Here, a group of scouts camp out in the woods where they're regaled with campfire tales of urban legends. One such tale involves a werewolf-like boy who stalks the very same woods where our youngsters have pitched their tents. And it soon becomes apparent that this particular urban legend may be a little more real than anyone expected. Gewurz does extremely well to set his stall out in the first half of the movie here, presenting a genuinely unnerving threat. There's also some fantastic performances here from a cast that is naturally a very young one, with Maurice Lucien particularly impressive as Sam, a member of this brigade who is bullied by his peers. Regardless of its young cast though, Cub does get incredibly gory when the action eventually starts to amp up, with the film far from afraid to dish out some bloodshed and brutality. Willow Creek. Hot on the heels of the fantastic slice of social commentary that was God Bless America, 2013 saw Bobcat Goldthwait deliver another gem in the form of Willow Creek, a found footage feature. The focus here is on Josh and Kelly as they search for Bigfoot. For Josh, he's adamant that the Sasquatch exists, while Kelly, she's a smidge more skeptical. They interview locals, learn of a strange missing persons case, find the spot where that infamous Patterson-Gimlin footage was filmed, and document their own spiraling paranoia as things take a turn for the creepy as this tale unravels. That this is Goldthwait's first and sadly only venture into horror makes Willow Creek all the more impressive, with the Police Academy favourite crafting a film that takes a delightfully slow burn approach to its tension and terror. Here we have a movie that's so much about what you don't see rather than what you do see, allowing your own imagination to wreak havoc on what may be out in the California woods. All in all, thoroughly excellent stuff from Bobcat and his leading duo Bryce Johnson and Alexi Gilmore. The She Creature. Mixing things up a little bit with a black and white feature from 1956, The She Creature is a horror that's often overlooked when compared to the likes of Creature from the Black Lagoon, House on Haunted Hill, Them, House of Wax, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. From director Edward L. Kahn, The She Creature centers on creepy carnival hypnotist Carlo Lombardi and poor Andrea Tolbert. You see, for Andrea, Lombardi hypnotizes her and gets her to delve into her past lives. It just so happens that Andrea's very first life saw her being a sea monster. Yes, a sea monster. Using all of his skills, Lombardi manages to manifest this monster into a physical form and has it do his nefarious bidding. Of course, the She Creature obviously looks extremely dated, but there's a certain warmth to that. After all, in a world where we're used to seeing all kinds of creatures being brought to life in exceptional detail on the silver screen, there's forever something endearing about just, simply seeing a fella wearing a dodgy costume. The Reef. To some, including this buffoon, Andrew Trauke's The Reef is the very best shark movie not named Jaws. Given how shark pictures so often have a stigma attached to them, The Reef swam under the radar in a mainstream sense. But this 2010 effort is absolutely masterful in how it crafts its tension and tells its story. In the most basic of terms, that story features a group of friends transporting a yacht from Australia to Indonesia. When that vessel capsizes though, these pals are in a 12-mile race to get to land as a great white shark circles in. This apex predator doesn't just go straight for the kill though, for it instead slowly plays with its food, menacing from afar before menacing from closer in to then making its actual move. Making this all the more terrifying, the events of The Reef were actually inspired by a real-life tragedy in 1983. There, Ray Boundy was the sole survivor of an incident which took the life of two others after their trawler capsized and a great white shark swooped in. Boundy would be rescued after spending a mammoth 36 hours in the water. Frankenhooker! There's always a special charm to the work of writer-director Frank Henenlotter, and never is that charm more prevalent than in 1990's Frankenhooker. After a bizarre lawnmower accident kills his fiancée Elizabeth, science whiz Jeffrey Franken concocts a scheme to bring his beau back from the dead. That scheme? Why, it's to subdue a group of hookers by using his patented super crack drug, cherry pick which limbs he wants from each lady, place Elizabeth's head atop of this creation, et voila! His lover will be resurrected. Of course, things aren't quite as straightforward as Jeffrey thinks, and his plans go awry when his super crack ends up causing these women to literally explode, which in turn angers pimp Zorro, who now has lost his income stream. Still, Patty Mullen's Elizabeth is technically brought back to life, although with an insatiable urge to have sex with strangers. And doing so kills those strangers due to, well, science stuff. In our titular Frankenhooker, we have one of the great cult horror characters, and with this movie, Frank Henenlotter delivered one of the great cult horror films.